Good Erev Shabbos, Parshas Matos Masei. In this Sedra, we have a fascinating response of Moshe Rabbeinu that is so apparently out of character, at least the Mefarshim think it's out of character, that it's worthwhile commenting on. Torah tells us that the Jewish people engaged in a war with Midian, and following that, at the conclusion of that battle, Moshe Rabbeinu was disappointed in the Jewish people that they had not eradicated all the people of Midian as they had been charged to do. Specifically, they had left the women folk around, and they took them captive, rather than eradicating them entirely. Now, leaving the question of the morality of this, these issues of life and death and war, Moshe Rabbeinu was upset at the Jewish people. Vayikzof Moshe al Pekudei HaChayil. Moshe Rabbeinu got angry at the commanders of the army. Sari alefim sari ameos habayim mitzvah milchama. Vayomer alihem, and he says to them, Achayisim kol nekeva. You left the women folk around, and in fact, you took them as captive, as becomes clear. Hein heina hayu livnei so b'dvar bilam, and yet these very same people who you showed compassion to, apparently compassion to, these are the very individuals who earlier on in Shittim, these women were the ones who ensnared and seduced the men of Bnei Yisrael, causing tremendous havoc and ultimately bringing about a response by Hashem in the form of a magefa, a plague which killed many. So Moshe Rabbeinu was not happy. He was disappointed and he was angered by the actions that were taken by the Jewish army. Now, this question, this character trait, seems to be a problem in Moshe Rabbeinu, because the very next story in the Torah tells us that when the Jews had to kosherize the non-kosher utensils that they had taken as booty from the Midianites, Moshe Rabbeinu was at a loss as to how to teach them the laws of koshering kalim, and it was left to the Kohen Elazar to offer that information. Now, this is not a very complicated halacha. I mean, it's not. One has to have knowledge, and one has to be educated. But Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest of all prophets, the greatest, the teacher of the law, the one who received the law from Hashem himself, was incapable, failed to remember the halachos of koshering kalim in order to educate the people, and thus it was left to Elazar. Rashi, citing the Chazal, were so perplexed by this that the explanation offered by Chazal is that Moshe Rabbeinu's anger was the cause of his forgetting this halacha. In other words, it seems that Moshe Rabbeinu was punished as a consequence of his anger. Moshe Rabbeinu's knowledge, his wisdom of the Torah failed him in this moment. And that should be a cautionary tale for any person when faced with the issue of getting angry. However, the challenge with this is that Moshe was justified in his anger. The Jewish people were supposed to carry out a certain charge, a certain mission, and they failed in their mission. So Moshe Rabbeinu was justified in his anger. Why should he be punished for being justifiably angry? Indeed, some Mefarshim say that the reason that Moshe Rabbeinu was angry because the people just simply failed to do a mitzvah. Whether they had good intentions, bad intentions, doesn't make a difference what the intentions of the people were. They failed to do a mitzvah. Others suggest that Moshe Rabbeinu was particularly upset because he thought that the reason, he understood that the reason that they had kept the women alive was not out of some act of compassion, but rather it was to engage in licentious and lustful, to keep them around for licentious and lustful purposes. So Moshe Rabbeinu was justifiably angry. Or others suggest that the women themselves were a great threat. This was no act of compassion to keep around your enemy. To say men, women, and children as though the women were somehow not a true threat to the Jewish people. That's failing to read the situation properly. You have orders. You're an army. Do what you're supposed to do. But what is the common denominator of all of these approaches is that Moshe Rabbeinu was justifiably angry. So if Moshe Rabbeinu was justifiably angry, why is it that Chazal tell us that if a person is angry, he is punished with the loss of his wisdom, of Torah, etc.? It doesn't seem to make sense. And yet, Moshe Rabbeinu was so tormented or so impacted by this anger, he couldn't remember even the most basic of halachas that an educated Jew would know. In fact, after Moshe Rabbeinu dies, the people were in such great mourning. Many of the halachas that Moshe had taught the people had become lost, and there was lack of clarity. The Chazal tell us 300 halachas Otniel ben Kenaz restored during the time as a consequence of the loss of the Masorah, the loss of the knowledge during the as a consequence of the impact of the mourning for Moshe Rabbeinu. So think about this. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Chasman says this, that if Otniel ben Kenaz was able to restore through the use of logic 300 halachas, Moshe Rabbeinu could not have somehow reached deep down into his memory banks and somehow construed a halachic construct that would have allowed him to develop, understand, or restore the laws of kashrus, basic laws of how to kasher kelim. Rabbi Abraham J. Twersky answers the question simply in two words, what he calls the toxicity of rage or the toxicity of anger. When a person is angry, it leads to all types of consequences for the person. Not a punishment, but a simple cause and effect. Rage and anger are the cause, and the effect are all types of things. For example, a person who gets angry, studies have shown that they lose the ability of mobility, to be able to move in as smooth and as an uncomplicated way as they do when they are not angry. So, for example, it becomes more difficult to walk, it becomes more difficult to drive, it becomes more difficult to simply write. Anything which requires motor function is impaired when a person is angry. That's not a punishment, that's a simple physiological consequence. And just as there is a physiological consequence to anger, a person's blood pressure rises, all types of changes go on in the body, and a person loses impulse control. Lots of things go on as a consequence of anger, not as a cause of anger, but as a consequence of anger. And just as that is true physiologically speaking, it is also true in terms of a person's ability to relate to others and to think and to communicate and to function. And maybe that's also physiological, has a physiological component to it. So when a person is angry, there's a toxicity to it. And that is perhaps what we can call ka'as chinam, like sinas chinam. When a person feels hatred and anger, it's not that it is baseless. It means that it is without self-interest, right? If I steal from a store because I'm hungry, then there's a self-interest in my engaging in that behavior. But if I engage in a behavior which works against my self-interest, that's like pointless. It's baseless. It's not meaningless. It is baseless. Like, why are we doing it if it works against my own self-interest? That's ka'as chinam, if you will, and sinas chinam. So Moshe Rabbeinu engaged in ka'as, which is chinam. It doesn't mean that it is not justifiable. It means that despite its being justifiable, it works against my self-interest. And why would I do something that works against my self-interest? When a person engages in that type of behavior, it leads to personal ruin, and when a community does so, it leads to communal ruin. Witness the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and the galus of 2,000 years of terror and tragedy, of terrible tragedy for the Jewish people. The antidote, the vaccine, if you will, for sinas chinam and ka'as chinam, for hatred and anger, is ahavas chinam, kindness, which also has no self-interest to it. Kindness which does not benefit me. And paradoxically, if we conduct ourselves in a way of chinam, loving kindness and compassion that does not help me, that is not in my self-interest, that is simply for the help of others, paradoxically, when there is no benefit to myself, we all do that together. We will create, in the end, a society in which we all benefit, and a geula shlema which will bring us great benefit. Good Shabbos to all.